This week, Kumar and I review Sonny Liew's book, The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. This is Tim.
This is Kumar.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Kumar in Melbourne. Seems like ages since the last time we did a podcast together. I can't remember what the last time was.
I have no memory of what it could have been. I think we've done a lot of side ones with other people. And yeah, I don't think we've been on together in a long time. I don't remember. I have no recollection of what it could have been.
Yeah, it's probably not as long ago as it seems, but probably
that's true too.
The end of last year or something. I don't know. So a year ago I was at MoCA and I met Sonny Liew there. He was one of the guests of honor at MoCA last year, and he had this book there. I think it had just come out at the time. The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye. And I talked to him a little bit for the podcast, like a minute or two. This is episode 492, if anybody wants to look it up. And I went back and listened to that, and it didn't really tell me anything that I didn't know after reading the book. But, and I probably would have picked up the book, and I probably would have bought it if I hadn't already bought Peter Cooper's big book, and I had to think about my luggage, fitting stuff in my luggage to come back to Japan. But here we are, we finally picked it up, and we're talking about it this time. And if you're not familiar with it, boy, how to describe this? So it appears to be, from the outside, biography of a comics creator, Charlie Chan Hock Chye. But this is a fictional creator. He doesn't actually exist. And so why tell the story of someone who doesn't exist? Well, this book has kind of several functions, and I was sort of I'm not even sure what the main function is, or if it doesn't have one single main function. But a lot of it is the history of Singapore from about World War II on. But it's also kind of a love letter to a lot of comics that came out over that period.
Yeah.
And Charlie Chan Hock Chye, really, Sonny Liew is very versatile.
Yeah, that aspect of it actually kind of surprised me, because I only know Sonny Liew from he did this comic called Molinky Robot, and I had 2 issues of that. And I think maybe there are only 2 issues. I'm not sure, but one was self-published, and one was put out through slave labor, maybe. And I only knew his work from that. I don't know what anything else he's done, but based on that, I thought he had a very distinct style, but I never imagined that he was a guy who could kind of ape a lot of different styles, or mimic a lot of different styles the way he does in this book, almost like Spiegelman would do, or I can't remember the names of the others, but there are a few guys out there in the industry who can kind of draw in a bunch of different styles, and he does pull it off quite well, a range of styles in this book, for sure.
Sonny Liew also in 2014 drew a book called The Shadow Hero, which was written by Gene Yang.
Okay.
Which I guess was kind of the last big thing that he did before this. But yeah, he's done some... I don't know that he's done any like Marvel or DC, but he's done a lot of different stuff. And when I... In that talk with him from a year ago, he said that he was finishing up some series he was working on, then he was going to do another graphic novel like this.
Okay. Can I say one other thing about it before we start?
Yeah.
So I knew that Sonny Liew had put out a book a year or two ago called The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye. I didn't know anything about it, except that it was one of these big, $40 hardcovers or whatever. And I was like, okay, and it wasn't really on my radar, but I was in India in January, and we flew back through Singapore, and we stopped for a couple of nights, and I went into the Kinokuniya in Singapore, one of the big ones, there's a few, and maybe the biggest one, and they had a table with, now I didn't know anything about the book, but they had a table with about, 50 copies of this thing, and I was like, oh boy, these guys screwed up, because they've ordered 50 copies of this book they're never going to sell. And I had no idea at the time that it was actually a book about Singapore, and that very Kinokuniya is actually in the book in one scene. So it shows what I know, but yeah, it was kind of funny. So I think it probably is a top, it is probably selling very well in Singapore. Because they had a lot of copies in stock, and it was very prominently displayed. And it was not a ordering mistake, as I assumed, that somebody put a 0 after the number of copies and got fired shortly afterwards. No, yeah. So it is. Yeah, it's about Singapore's history. And interestingly, to jump way ahead, I mean, there's a lot in the book about. It kind of relates to me seeing all those copies there, but there's a lot in the book about how much the government is suppressing the media in Singapore and making sure only nice things are said about the government in an almost totalitarian way, and arresting people or, shutting down newspapers, or imposing very strict restrictions on them. I'm kind of surprised that this book exists and is able to have 50 copies prominently displayed in Kinokuniya, because it's so critical of the very same government for that very reason.
Yeah. Well, I found that so Singapore's National Arts Council had originally given Liew a grant to work on this book, and then when they saw it, they withdrew the grant.
Really?
Yeah, they said it had sensitive content.
Wow. That's amazing. Was that in the footnotes of this, or did you read that somewhere else?
I found it someplace else. I read a few reviews of the book.
Wow, that is an amazing fact. So, yeah.
Well, and you notice in particular, so Lee Kuan Yew, who was in charge there for many, many years after it became an independent country, he's portrayed in a positive light in kind of the first half of the book, but then he becomes viewed, much more as kind of an authoritarian in the latter part, and I think that was, what turned them off when they saw the latter part of the book.
Right. But was he with he was in the ruling party, or he? Oh yeah, he wasn't one of the communists, right?
No, he wasn't one of the communists. Right. But he's one of those two guys who pop up in a lot of these different comics that Charlie Chan Hock Chye supposedly did.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we see Singapore going through when the Japanese occupation, and then Britain after the war. It had been a British colony for a long time. Britain lets it go, and then they try to join what was then Malaya to become Malaysia in the 60s. And I had kind of known that Singapore joined Malaysia and then left Malaysia shortly after. It was 2 years later, but I didn't really understand why. And now at least I have some understanding of that. Of course, it's pretty complicated, but
it is complicated, and I didn't know any of it. I was I don't know anything about the history of Singapore. I just went a month ago and was like, oh, this is a super beautiful city. and really didn't give it any more thought than that. But,
yeah, I mean, I knew who Lee Kuan Yew was. I'd never heard of Lim Chin Siong, who was the other of the two main guys there.
Yeah, I didn't know any of that, and I did find it was really educational in that respect. But I did find, I mean, it's 300 pages, more than that if you count the footnotes at the back.
Yeah, the end notes.
And I found both. I read it twice before this happened. I found by about the second half, I started to get confused about the names of people and keeping track of who was in which party and all this stuff. And even at the end of the second reading, I was like, okay, I'm confused about what happened when after about the halfway point. And I don't know if it's just the. I don't want to say it's just the names, but the interesting thing is he really holds your hand through explaining everything, because often what happens is this fictional Chan character he's created will enter a phase of cartooning where he's like, okay, I'm going to do a Pogo style comic, and Sonny Liew will mimic the Pogo art style and even the language of it.
Yeah, the writing style.
Right. So, and they will have that, the strip will have very simplified, distilled analogs of these political figures in it. And you'll have the strip, and then you'll have an explanation of like, okay, this character represents this politician, and this crocodile is this politician, and this is what happened, and that's what this strip is explaining. So he's explained it twice. He's done it in a very simple comic book that any 2-year-old can understand. Well, not 2, but anyway, any kid can understand. And he's explained the actual political background, and it was still getting very tangled. Mm-hmm. I felt, especially later, there were all these, well, I don't know, maybe there weren't that many conflicting parties, but I just felt like there was such an accrual of detail and history and names that it became a bit overwhelming for me.
Yeah, well, I know what you mean. Like in the Pogo ripoff, it's called Bukit Chapalang. I mean, he works on that for a while and with his partner, and then they go do some other stuff, and then the partner quits to get married, and Chan goes back to doing Bukit Chapalang, and so then it's referring to somebody that was supposed to get arrested, and I was kind of like, who's getting arrested now? And I was flipping back and trying to identify which character that was, and I couldn't find it. But yeah, it does get a little confusing, in spite of the hand-holding.
And I think
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think later on, too, in the second half, I think he's kind of more, I think Liew is expecting you to flip to the footnotes more than the first half. Like, the first half, you don't really need to look at the back to figure out who this person was or when they were arrested or stuff like that. Like, in the second half, it seems like stuff just happens, and you're like, who's this guy? And what happened, so it was a bit...
Yeah, well, the end notes, I wasn't sure how useful the end notes were. I mean, I would go look at the end notes, and then I was kind of like, I don't really need to know this. Or, I mean, I think the comic kind of covers that. Or
Yeah.
I know what San Diego Comic-Con is. There's an end note about that. But yeah, the Singapore stuff, okay. I mean, a lot of that is kind of in the comic anyway. But I mean, it's kind of there if you really want to get into the Singapore history deep.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was more kind of soaking in how much work this was.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's a monumental achievement, and I'm amazed that he didn't give up, and I'm amazed at some of the things he tried. And I mean, some of them are a little bit less successful than others. Like, there's one where he does a Spider-Man knockoff, but it's pre-Spider-Man, called Roachman. He has almost the same origin. But it's lettered in.
They say that, oh yeah, Spider-Man ripped us off. It's cockroach or Roachman.
Roachman, but it's lettered in the Jim Lee Wildwords font, so it's kind of anachronistic. So there were a couple of maybe little shortcuts that, maybe a couple of strips didn't work. I mean, the Pogo strip, he did a lot of those. I don't think it was ever as good as Pogo, which is maybe not a fair criticism.
What's as good as Pogo?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a strip that we still need to get to on this podcast. We haven't done a Pogo episode.
I'm even thinking like the Alan Moore and Swamp Thing, his Pogo thing, they were aliens. Like that was the only way to kind of tackle it. But it was kind of hard to do do the language and all of that. That one in particular seemed like kind of a poor man's Pogo. But I liked it kind of, the early stuff looked like early Tezuka, and I thought that worked really well. I'm trying, just trying to remember some of the others. So there's the autobiographical stuff, which is done in a kind of, I don't know, like Liu's own style or the style he's invented for the book, which is supposed to be drawn by Chan himself.
I made a list of some of the stuff. I think I got this is almost a total list.
Rattle them off.
There's he does a little bit on Dream of the Rarebit Fiend.
Yes.
Does a Mad parody featuring Singaporean comedians, like Mad Magazine, not the Mad Comics, but the later stuff. Let's see. There's the one that's based on Frank Hampson's Dan Dare that he calls Invasion.
Yes.
Some Harvey Kurtzman war comics.
That was really good.
With animals like, as in mouse, symbolizing the different groups of people.
Yeah.
Let's see. Part of the stuff about San Diego is in Tintin style.
Yeah.
There's the whole thing that's in Dark Knight Returns style.
Yeah.
Near the end, there's some Scrooge McDuck type stuff.
Yes, that's right.
The one that was...
And the Dark Knight one was actually based on Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle as well.
Yes.
So there's some mix-up stuff, and there's another couple I want to mention. I don't know if you're at the end of your list or not.
Well, there's this thing of the Singapore Inks one.
Right.
It's like a stationery company with Lee Kuan Yew in charge. I wasn't sure what that was referencing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe some Asian comic.
It's funny because he often says explicitly what it's based on. He says, like, this is based on Pogo or this is based on Dan Dare. And he didn't mention that, so maybe there isn't one.
It could be.
One that he didn't mention that I thought kind of, I don't know, whole aspects of the book reminded me of was there's a Malaysian artist named Lat who's been doing autobiographical comics for decades and decades. And he's kind of a national treasure, and some of his books have been released in English. And that, I couldn't help but think of that while I was reading it. The other thing is the San Diego sequence, like he decides to save enough money to go to San Diego in 1988 for Comic-Con, and that reminded me of the Filipino artists from the 70s. Remember, was there a word for like Filipino invasion or something where Marvel and DC hired all those Filipino artists at the same time? Basically, and there was kind of an inrush of them.
Like Steve Lee Aloha.
Yeah, or either it was before that. I'm trying to remember, like Ernie Chan, I think was one, and there were like 7 or 8 of these guys that were amazing artists that Marvel hired and paid like low wages. But they were working on Conan and stuff like that, and I can't remember the names of all of them. But that aspect of it kind of reminded me of that as well.
By the way, did you notice? Charlie goes to San Diego Comic-Con when he is 50 years old.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's a coincidence or what, but so on page 267, he includes the actual San Diego Comic-Con events guide cover, which is a Steve Lee Aloha illustration with a caption on it that says 50 years ago. So and I didn't quite get what this picture was. It's a woman reading Superman #2.
Yeah, well, 88 was the 50th anniversary of Superman.
Okay. So, I mean, Charlie was born in the same year Superman was born?
Well, of course, because if he's a fictional character, you might as well, you might as well funnel all your themes into this one. That's, in that sense, like, he follows the history of his life is, that's, it follows American comics history, and to a certain extent, like I said, and the comics are coming out of the Philippines or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's all kind of, by him being born in 38, it's a way for his life to encompass the history of comics to the present.
Yeah, well, and as he goes through these different adaptations, Liew is matching up, what's going on in comics at this time, what's going on in Charlie's life, what's going on in Singapore. Yeah. So they all kind of connect in that way. And he's had to go, follow the history of his fictional character with two other histories of things that actually happened.
Yes, yeah, for sure. There's definitely, there's a few different, streams that are going on. So there's the character study of Chan, and there's the history of comics, and then there's the history of Singapore. Did you find it interesting that, there's this whole thing where his parents are pressuring him to get married, and have kids and get a good job so he can take care of them, and his partner goes off and gets married and has kids and becomes a conservative and a supporter of the ruling party, whereas he used to criticize it. I found it very interesting as a character that Chan never got married and never had kids. And a lot of his comics apparently were never published because he was worried about governmental interference. I just found that fascinating. We don't know how he made money. Apparently he didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't publish a lot of comics, and we don't know what, we know his dad died. We don't know what happened to his mother. Maybe she's still alive. But I found that really interesting.
Well, and then I felt like the partnership of Charlie and his partner Bertrand was supposed to be kind of a mirror of Lee Kuan Yew and Lim Chin Siong, who also had a rift. Right. And I hadn't quite caught that. There are a couple interviews with Bertrand in there, and I guess he does kind of his politics change, but Charlie, maybe both in Singapore politics and in comics, he's not willing to compromise.
Yeah, that's right. Right to the very end. Yeah.
And so, none of his dreams really come true, including, it's pretty clear that he's in love with Lily. Yes. He never says so, but she keeps kind of popping up.
Yeah.
But she's, the daughter of Bertrand's uncle?
She's Bertrand's cousin, right?
Yeah.
So, okay.
But, she ends up getting married to somebody else. But, every once in a while he'll mention her. And in that fantasy comic of what would happen at San Diego, where he'd get swept up and, made famous and whatever. Yeah. And there she is, congratulating him.
Yeah. Yeah, he almost, that was interesting because he almost expects us to... He just mentions Lily once in a while, or there's a portrait of her, or there's a portrait of an actress that resembles her. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like, without ever saying anything about her, it's like Chan is assuming that we know how he feels about her.
Yeah.
Because she's in it very little. But the fact that he mentions her 3 or 4 times is like, Chan... She ended up marrying some other person or something like that. The wording was very, is very delicately balanced. Mm-hmm. I felt like he was saying, she didn't marry me, which is what I wanted, even though he never says that.
Yeah. Well, and the scene where he meets her, and Bertrand is there too, and Bertrand is talking to him, but the word balloon is empty because Charlie's not paying attention to him.
Right, yeah.
He's captivated by Lily from the beginning.
Yeah, that was great.
And there's that one sequence where they're talking about movies in Singapore, and you see a shot of the audience in a movie theater, and there are those 2 arrows saying me and Lily. And they're sitting together, although we can't see them because they're too far away, but they're there in the theater, and that's just a couple pages before she gets married.
Right. That reminded me actually of another art style which we didn't mention, was these sketches of old Singapore, like in the 60s. And to me, these were some of the most amazing bits, and they're mostly front-loaded. They're at the front of the book. But looking at these drawings, you get a kind of nostalgic feeling for Singapore. Like, you really get a feel of what it would have been like in the 60s, and I felt like in the 50s and 60s. But I mean, Sonny Liew was not around, I'm assuming.
No, he's not that old. I know.
No, but he kind of captured the drawings in a way that someone who was there at that time would have drawn them, and capture that nostalgia for an era that he never lived in.
Yeah.
And even invoke that nostalgia in me. Like, I was looking at it thinking, feeling that way. I just thought those bits were really beautiful.
Yeah, and I wonder how, the older stuff, or the quote-unquote older stuff, he's made it look old somehow. Yeah, he's kind of aged the pages.
He's yellowed the pages or drawn them with something. Yeah.
Yeah, like the Tezuka-ish stuff, and I don't know how he did that.
Yeah, I think you can do some of that kind of stuff in Photoshop, but it just seems like such a huge job to make stuff look 60 years old. And even the even coloring, the coloring is different for different stuff. The Pogo section, which we came, and the Dan Dare stuff really looks Dan Dare-ish the way he's colored it. There's some.
Yeah, I'd like to know how many years this took.
I don't know. There's even one. There's a doll of the character. I'm looking at page 259. Like, he had to build that or
right? Yeah, stuffed figure of that. What's his name from the Tezuka-ish?
Yeah.
Here we go. Ahwat doll from 1988.
Yeah. But didn't you, on the other side of the history thing, like from the first 10, 15 pages even, both times I read it, I was like, didn't the British just ruin everything for everybody by going around and these colonies? Like, they just formed these colonies and just almost by, I don't know, making them dependent and then abandoning them because they wanted their freedom, of course, and they deserved it, but just left everything in a mess. And it's the same almost everywhere that the British set up colonies. I just felt like that was almost the starting point.
Right, yeah, the Middle East, Africa.
Yeah.
Coming up, things we found inaccessible in the book. The worst time in Charlie's life? Really? The dark side of Singapore, and more. But first, help Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Poles move up to bigger and better things. Pledge a few bucks a month via Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. I'm trying to find a way to make podcasting into a career. Your pledges at Patreon can help make it happen, which would free me up to make that much more content. Help us out at patreon.com/deconcomics. It's DCP In Touch, where we hear from our listeners. Michael Yakutis said, "Great to hear Gerhard in an interview. He's one of the greats. It sounds like there is more to the Cerebus buyout story, but he kept it classy and professional. Him and Dave continued to be huge influences for me in my own work." Thanks, Michael. If you have any comments or questions for us, write to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on Twitter @deconcomics, or you can leave a comment on the blog at deconstructingcomics.com.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Short Box Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
and the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
Continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
As I going through this, I kind of wondered if Liew kind of partway through had second thoughts about how to tell the story. Because did you notice?
Okay.
So at the beginning, we've got just kind of captions and some comics of elderly Charlie Chan talking, and then talking about his past life, and then suddenly on page 85, Liew himself is a comics character as a narrator.
Right.
Right. And he never appears before that, and there's no introduction. Just suddenly he's there.
Yes.
And it's like he must. I wondered if he felt like he was having trouble telling the story clearly, and so he needed to insert himself in there kind of belatedly.
There's a section where that's almost kind of explicit. I think it's at Pogo or later. Maybe it's later. I'm just trying to find it.
Yeah, well, he shows up more and more as it goes on.
There's a strip. Oh no, it's during the stuff with the Singapore inks. Where there's a strip along the bottom of the page, the pages where Liew is trying to explain the strips again to this kid this kid character who doesn't want to look at the footnotes at the back of the book. Or no, it is the Pogo stuff. So I'm looking around page 194, 195 is where it starts. Mm-hmm. And so you've got the Pogo strip, which is, like I said before, a very simplified version of Singapore politics at the time. You've got a paragraph of text explaining what's what, and then you've got another thing at the bottom, which is the third explanation, which is Sonny Liew explaining to this kid in a baseball cap what more stuff in the strip. So it did kind of feel like it was getting away from him, and it was getting away from me at that stage too. I was kind of like, no, now I've got 3 explanations to follow. I'm kind of wondering if, do we need the explanations, or I guess we sort of do, but some of it's so I don't know. Is he double explaining stuff that doesn't need double explaining? Like the Mad strip, where did we need explanations of everything, or would it have been fine without the additional paragraph explaining who the character? Well.
Well, I'm sure he's sensitive to the fact that a lot of the readers don't know anything about Singapore, and so he might have erred on the side of explaining too much. I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know is the ultimate answer. Because with this Mad parody, which looks very much like a 70s Mad Magazine parody, you go through this museum, which explains the history of Singapore in a satirical way, of course. And there's an explanation about who the 2 characters were and how they were based on local stand-up comedians. But even with that explanation, if you're not familiar with those guys, it doesn't resonate on that level. That level up doesn't resonate.
Yeah, it kind of falls flat. I mean, there's nothing really funny about it, even though it looks like it should be funny.
Yeah, that's how I felt about some of the pogos.
Mhm.
Again, it's a very difficult thing to, it's easy to pull off, no, I shouldn't say easy, but you can pull off the visuals. Sometimes the jokes are a bit harder to match, or maybe we just don't have any context for the jokes. It's,
Mhm.
again, everything on that level, it's very hard to say with the book, has he done too much or not enough, even. Or should he have made a different decision, or is this going to play completely differently for a Singapore audience?
Yeah. I wondered. I mean, besides the partnership bit, I wondered if he was sort of putting Charlie there as sort of a analog to Singapore,
Right.
and Charlie's dreams don't come true because he's sticking so much to his principles. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if he's trying to say something about Singapore there.
I don't think so, because he seems to be on the opposite end of the political spectrum from, Singapore having the PAP government in place with uncontested, like winning every seat for 15, 20 years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And Chan seems to be opposed to what's happening in the government. For me, I don't think he's...
Yeah, or maybe it's a contrast to Singapore rather than a
yeah,
correlation.
maybe so. Yeah, that is maybe more the case. Certainly, he's a stand-in for the history of comics. But
yeah, I mean, he seems to make the wrong bet every time. Like,
yeah,
in particular, on page 200, where he has illustrated a booklet teaching the Bahasa Melayu language to Singaporeans, the Malaysian language, for the purpose of the merger. And then because of race riots and political tensions, the merger goes south, the publication is canceled, and Chan never gets paid.
Yeah. There was also a chapter, there was a chapter called, like, the worst time of his life or something.
Oh, yeah, I was going to mention that too. That was the thing I was trying to, what was it I wanted to say? Oh, yeah.
Well, it certainly didn't seem like the worst time.
Well, yeah, a couple of times it points out that this, apparently, Charlie Chan Hock Chye did a autobiographical comic about his early years called The Most Terrible Time of My Life.
Right.
But, yeah, I wondered if he called it that because he had all these dreams at the time about his comics career and about Lily that didn't come true. And maybe he looks back on it regretfully, and that's why now it seems like the most terrible time. That was the only thing I could think of, because it doesn't seem like a terrible time.
No, it seems like a time of hope, certainly, because he hasn't been beaten down for 50 years at that stage.
Yes.
He's right at the beginning, and in fact, they get a studio to work in, and they start drawing strips, and it seems like everything's on the up and up. So
yeah, and they get set up in his uncle's upstairs room as a studio, and yeah, it seems like everything's going great.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we're reading too much into the title. Maybe the title is for, I don't know. Maybe it's referring to some other section of his life.
No, I'm sure that's right, because it says opposite. I'm looking at 58, where it says opposite page and following, The Most Terrible Time of My Life, 1991, self-published.
Right, okay.
At the age of 53, Chan began working on what was meant to be a multi-volume autobiographical comic. Only one volume was ever completed, however, covering the period 1955 to 1963.
Right. So was the title supposed to be for the one volume or for the whole series?
His whole life was the most terrible time of his life?
I don't know. I don't know. But he's so persistent, even though apparently we don't know where he's making his money from. I don't remember. Oh, he does get a watchman. He gets a night watchman job.
Right.
That's described at one stage. So he's making a little bit. He's making, subsistence level, enough to survive. Not enough to take care of his parents.
Right, yeah, he can't save up, and he can't get his father the medical treatment, and he passes away.
But he's still sticking with comics and drawing in 50 different styles, and he's drawing stuff that he knows will not be published and has no intention to publish because he knows the government wouldn't allow it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's what's kind of surprised me was, you're assuming that this book, fictional or not, this artist must have been successful if there's a book about him. But it turns out that he actually was not commercially successful at all.
Yeah.
And is apparently not even famous in that fictional world.
It's almost like...
in spite of how versatile he is.
Yeah, but we're at the stage in comics now where often you get these books come out hardcovers or big 200-page books that are like the art of XYZ, and this person is somebody who's kind of been forgotten or lost. Almost like the Fletcher Hanks books that have come out. And they've kind of been recovered, or... they're being reinstated or back into the canon by the Discovery. And I really, before I read this book, I thought it was about a real guy who, a real Singaporean artist who we hadn't heard of before, but was like the Tezuka of Singapore. But no, he's more like a guy that just worked in his bedroom and published 3 or 4 comics and was kind of forgotten. Yeah. I don't know if it's feasible. Like, I think that aspect of the plot, I don't quite buy it, but I don't think that's the point. I don't think we're supposed to believe that this guy could draw in 50 different styles and not have any success, over 80 years.
Well, although except for the fact that he was quite a copycat.
Yes.
Doesn't really have an original style.
But he didn't even... Oh, yeah, he did try to get into commercial illustration, but, he found that was also counter to his ethics, so he gave that up quickly as well. Because it seems to me that's something, given the fact that he was so versatile, he could have made a lot of money at.
Yeah, and then Liew does a number of portraits of 60s movie stars, which are pretty good, too.
Yeah, those are done in the kind of Peter Arno New Yorker style.
Mm-hmm.
Not New Yorker, but yeah. So it's another style that he kind of copies as well.
Yeah, and then there were points where I wasn't quite sure if what I was looking at was Liew or if it was real. Like that San Diego program cover that turned out to be real. Or there are some newspaper articles which I believe are real.
Yes. Yeah.
But there was another place where they had taken the Eagle, the publication that Dan Dare was in, and mocked it up into the Dragon, the publication that they put their Invasion comic in. And so Liew had to do that, to mock up the Dragon.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of seamless. What's real and what's not.
Yeah, there were some bits that were totally amazing. Unfortunately, I didn't write them down. But I mean, stuff like that stuffed doll and some of it was really amazingly like, oh, this must have been a real guy, even though you're 200 pages in, it's all fictionalized. Yeah, it's astonishing, I think, those aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I said, I think from the second half, I felt like it was I don't know if it's too long. But as soon as you say that, as soon as I think that, now I realize that Liew is pulling a Chan. Like, he's just going to keep making comics whether we like it or not. And just pile another 100 pages in there and, more Singapore history whether we like it or not.
And more comics history.
Yeah, I have to say I'm glad I read it after going to Singapore, because if I'd read it before, I would have certainly looked at it in a less positive light. Because it was... I don't know, have you ever been there?
No, I haven't.
Because it's like you show up and it's like a utopia. It's the most beautiful, perfect looking place with all these beautiful high rises and everything's perfectly manicured. And it's just amazing. It's like a paradise. You're like, wow, this is so great. And then after reading this, I was like, oh, so they built those skyscrapers by literally burning down people's houses to force them out. And you just learn about all this horrible stuff, and there's no freedom of the press, and it's really what's going on behind the scenes to make it as lovely as it is externally is, probably pretty awful. And people being arrested and being held indefinitely without trial and all this stuff. It's not really. I never really knew that kind of stuff was happening in Singapore, and it probably would have tarnished my, my vision of it.
Well, I didn't go back and look it up, but what was it, like 20 years ago? There was, I think, like a diplomat's kid who did some just like, minor vandalism of some kind and
was caned.
Was caned, yes.
It's more like, I remember it was big news. I remember seeing it on Donahue. So it must have been like around 90. Yeah, they're very, they're strict, because, there's a no chewing gum rule.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh, okay, that's how, so they have strict laws, and that's how they keep it that way. But you don't realize they have, like, that's what I would call a strict law, not what I would call an unjust law, which would be, like, being jailed indefinitely without trial, or, stifling the press, or things that I would consider unethical or immoral. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I just looked it up here. So the vandalism was in October 1993. Cars parked at apartment blocks were being damaged with hot tar, paint remover, red spray paint, and hatchets. Taxi drivers complained that their tires were slashed. So,
the thing I would say, the other thing I would say about that is that's a situation too where they've got strict laws, right? So this kid was the son of a diplomat. Mm-hmm. Like, how strict it is over there, and if you do something like that, the punishment's going to be bad. Even if it's unfair by other countries' standards, or if it's severe by other countries' standards, you know that. Going to Singapore, don't chew the gum. It's against the rules.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're jailed because you're a communist and there's no trial and you're there for 30 years in jail or whatever, that's crazy. That's a whole other thing that you can't be prepared for. Certainly if I was to visit again, I would certainly look at it a lot differently after reading it.
But just for the record, the kid's name was Michael Fay. I'd forgotten about that. So he was 18 at the time.
Right. And did he get caned? Was that?
Yeah, I believe he did.
Yeah, so we never heard, I don't remember hearing a single word after it happened. It was all before people were up in arms.
Right, yeah. I know a lot of people were trying to stop them from doing it, but they failed to stop it, and that was kind of that afterwards.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm wondering what that guy's up to now.
Anyway, anything else to say about this?
I don't know. I certainly recommend it because you will learn something about a place you probably don't know much about, and it's a real tour de force in terms of the artistic accomplishment of it. Mm-hmm. I think it's a little bit flawed, for the reasons I said before. I think it kind of has difficulty containing everything in the second half. Mm-hmm. But it's a real achievement. I'm looking forward to the next, whatever Sonny Liew does next.
Yeah, artistically, how can you top this?
Yeah.
Sonny Liew's The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye is published in the U.S. by Pantheon. If you're interested in buying the book, get it via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and help out our show. You can write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look up Deconstructing Comics on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. Last Thursday on To the Bat Polls, we saw off Julie Newmar in her last appearance as Catwoman in the Catwoman Goes to College arc. Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. A new episode is coming this Thursday right here in this podcast feed. Next week, my brother Paul joins me to talk about David Hodgdu's The 10-Cent Plague, a study of controversies over comics content in the first half of the 20th century, culminating in the investigations of EC Comics and the creation of the Comics Code. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.